Hello, Glenn Sample here. Welcome back to my channel, The Men on the Sixth Floor. Today we're going to discuss two little pieces of information that have turned out to be very important and often overlooked by other researchers. Now, we hope that you will enjoy the video presentation. I enjoyed making it, and so we'll meet again at the end of the film and discuss a couple little things, so hang on until then. But for now, enjoy the video presentation examining two small pieces of evidence. One of the most popular theories about the JFK assassination for decades now is the account of Deputy Roger Craig. Here's an example of one of the comments I get about this particular subject, and I get lots of these. The only credible source, says one viewer, the only credible source on Oswald's escape from the Texas School Book Depository was Roger Craig, who stated that he witnessed Oswald exit the front door, travel down the grassy knoll, and get into a Rambler station wagon. The evening of the shooting, Craig positively identified Oswald as at the police station as the man he saw leaving the Texas School Book Depository.
A Dallas Sheriff's Officer Roger Craig said Oswald was definitely the man he saw run from the Texas Book Depository building right after the assassination. He said that Oswald whistled at a man in a station wagon. The man stopped and the two drove away. Police said a few minutes later, Officer J.D. Tippett was slain by an unknown man as he was trying to arrest about 2 miles from the scene of the assassination.
So today we're going to discuss two important pieces of evidence that no doubt will invalidate Roger Craig's story. Roger Craig testified that it was about 15 minutes after the shots were fired that he saw Oswald leave the building, run down the grassy slope, and climb into a Rambler driven by a dark-skinned man. However, two pieces of evidence that we will now examine prove that Lee Harvey Oswald left the building in as little as 3 minutes after the assassination. And after walking out of the front steps of the Texas School Book Depository, Oswald walked east on Elm Street for about 7 blocks to the corner of Elm and Murphy, where he boarded a bus by banging on the door for the driver to open it. The bus was heading back in the direction of the School Book Depository building on its way to Oak Cliff section of Dallas. Now, time-wise, Cecil McWaters, the bus driver, said he had passed a checkpoint at St. Paul and Elm Street at about 12:36 p.m., and he was sure he left the checkpoint on time, and he estimated that it took him 3 to 4 minutes to drive 3 blocks west from the checkpoint to Field Street, which he reached at about 12:40 p.m. Then, just beyond Field Street, in very slow traffic, Oswald came and beat on the door of the bus, and he boarded it and paid his fare. About 2 blocks later, in the middle of the block, a woman asked to get off to make a 1 o'clock train appointment at Union Station and requested a transfer. McWaters issued her a transfer and opened the door, and as she was going out, Oswald, who he had picked up just about 2 blocks back, also asked for a transfer and got off at the same place in the middle of the block where the lady did. It was at the intersection near Lamar Street. This would have been approximately 12:44, or 14 minutes after the shots were fired. This, of course, means that whoever Craig saw running down the grassy slope and whisked away in a Rambler station wagon could not have been Lee Harvey Oswald. So, our first important piece of evidence is this: the bus transfer. Yes, here it is. It is an important piece of evidence, small as though it may be. When Oswald was arrested, this bus transfer marked for the Lakewood Marsalis route was found in his shirt pocket. The transfer was dated Friday, November 22nd, 63, and was punched in 2 places by the bus driver. On the basis of this punch mark, which was distinctive to each Dallas bus driver, the transfer was conclusively identified as having been issued by Cecil J. McWaters, a bus driver for the Dallas Transit Company. All right, so that was our first piece of evidence. Now to our second piece of evidence. Perhaps unknown to Oswald, riding on the bus was an elderly woman named Mary Bledsoe. Oswald had rented a room for Mrs. Bledsoe about 6 weeks before, on October 7th, but she had asked him to leave at the end of a week. Mrs. Bledsoe told him, "I'm not going to rent to you anymore." She testified, "I didn't like his attitude. There was just something about him I didn't like. I just didn't want him around me." But on November 22nd, Miss Bledsoe came downtown to watch the presidential motorcade. She boarded the Marsalis bus at St. Paul and Elm Streets to return home. As she testified further, "After we got past Ackerd at Murphy, I figured it out. Let's see, I don't know for sure. Oswald got on. He looked like a maniac. He was dirty. His sleeve was out there, and his shirt was undone, and there was a hole in his sleeve right here." As Mrs. Bledsoe said these words, she pointed to her right elbow. Now, to our second piece of evidence, Oswald's torn shirt. When Oswald was arrested in the Texas Theater, he was wearing a brown sports shirt with a hole in the right sleeve at the elbow. Mrs. Bledsoe identified the shirt as the one Oswald was wearing, and she stated she was certain that it was Oswald who boarded the bus. Mrs. Bledsoe recalled that Oswald sat halfway to the rear of the bus, which moved slowly and intermittently as traffic became very heavy at this time. So why would Roger Craig stick to a story that was simply wrong? Was he lying? Was he confused? Well, I personally have never met Roger Craig, but in his interviews, he appears to be a charming, convincing man. Other researchers who knew Mr. Craig had mixed reviews about him. For example, Mary Farrell says, and I quote, "I knew Roger Craig for several years before his death. It is my belief that Roger was a very sick young man. He had made a name for himself as a very promising young law enforcement officer. When he came forward with some of the stories he told following the events of that November weekend, he believed that he would be offered a great deal of money and possibly speaking engagements, and I'm very sorry to say that I am one of the few conspiracy nuts who never believed Roger Craig." When Roger made a number of speeches about the fact that they prevented him from getting a job, I talked to my husband into giving him a job. Roger did not want to work. He wanted people to give him money because he had seen something or another. And I have made enemies because I have continued to say that I have never really believed him. Craig also charged that his Warren Commission testimony had been altered or tampered with. And while most conspiratists will readily believe such charges, another icon among conspiracy researchers, Harold Weisberg, did not. He strongly rejected his claims. Here I quote Harold when he says, "Roger Craig may be a brave guy and all of that, but he is also full of what is generally reserved for toilets. I have gone over his annotation of his testimony as printed, and his account of the changes is utterly impossible. I spent too many years working with court reporters, particularly the firm the commission used, to find if it was possible to credit this in any way. I have traced that testimony all the way from Dallas to the government printing office, and it is printed as it was taken down. I have copies of the typescript sent to the GPO. I have the letter of transmittal to D.C., the bills for taking it, the whole story. Roger is, despite Penn Jones' great love for him, at best simply wrong. Now I have met Roger, and he's a fine-looking, clean-cut kind of guy who appears to be truthful, serious, and all that, just like dozens of guys I once guarded in an Army-locked ward in a large mental institution. He does not impress me as the kind of guy who is out to make trouble, but he is. And then there's Craig's own daughter, who said in a letter to a JFK group headed by John Simpkin a few years ago, she said, "There are a few items in your article about Roger Craig you just might want to correct for the sake of accuracy and truth in reporting. His marriage didn't end due to repeated harassments or threats, unless you count his repeated threats to end his own life. The man was disturbed. As his daughter, I would place money on the fact that he suffered from either borderline personality disorder or bipolar depression. I'm not disputing that what he thought he saw was something different from what was reported, but let's face it, my dad didn't know a Mauser from whatever. He was a Wisconsin farm boy who joined the Army illegally and was released from duty because he kept injuring himself. And I note you don't mention the self-inflicted scars from his tour of duty. Furthermore, it is exactly this kind of dramatic license that killed my father. It fed his disease. It fed his paranoia, and in the end, it contributed to his self-destruction." Well, that was interesting, wasn't it? Two little pieces of evidence mean so much. You know, the first piece of evidence was found on Oswald when he was arrested, and it was of course, a transfer slip. And this little thing proves that it was issued by the bus driver, Cecil McWaters, and Oswald was definitely on the bus. We know from that ticket what time he was on the bus, what time he got on the bus, what time he got off the bus. Notice the shirt. She noticed that there was a hole in the shirt. When she said that, she pointed to her right elbow. And when he was arrested, he was wearing a shirt with a torn sleeve on the right elbow. So all these things prove that Oswald was on the bus. He did not run down the grassy knoll, as Craig said, and get into a Nash Rambler and drive away. He was on the bus, and from there, of course, we know he went to the Greyhound bus depot, got on a taxi, took him to his rooming house, and of course, the rest is history. This all happened very quickly, but these two little pieces of evidence help us put the whole thing together and solidify the fact that this is evidence that's incontrovertible. We know that what Craig saw and he thought was Lee Oswald, he was just simply mistaken. Other people saw the same man, by the way, and get into a car and leave, but it couldn't have been Lee Oswald. Watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Agree or disagree, that's fine. The information is there, and I enjoy putting it out there for you. So please, if you haven't already, subscribe, and you'll be notified when any new video comes out. So until then, Glenn Sample saying goodbye.